Hello, my name is Marrissa Coccaro, and this is a practice run-through of my lecture, Put a Ring on It. Some quick housekeeping. I do not have an audience with me today, so I will be saying things like pause for audience interaction. Also, because I don't have anyone to pause for, I will be taking sips of water every once in a while. My name is Marrissa Coccaro, and over the past decade, I have written for the stage, the screen, podcasts, and I have recently begun to write my own novels. The thing that has helped me stand out as a writer over this past decade is ring composition, which is what this lecture is about. I am excited to share all that I've learned, and I am excited for other people to start writing this way. So I have a community. In my humble opinion, there are two reasons why every writer should be at least aware of this unique story structure. Not only will it help you with your internal creative process, but it will help your audience remember your story better. But first, let's talk about what we already know. This is the moment where I would ask the audience what they know about 3-act structure. Hopefully, one of them will say something along the lines of beginning, middle, and end. This is the very basic of any story, broken down into these 3 things, and no offense, but duh. Obviously, every story has a beginning, and yes, every story has to end somewhere. And technically, anything that comes in between that is called the middle. This provides writers with very little guidance. As time has gone on, we've added more guidance, but the basic idea of the 3-act is not helpful in the long run, at least in my opinion. We do have other structures like Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey or Nigel Watt's 8-point arc, and we aren't going to go into them too much, but my issue with those structures is that they tell you exactly what has to happen in your story and exactly when it has to happen in your story. They are highly prescriptive. And while that does provide a lot of guidance, which is my grievance with the 3-act structure, they don't offer that much freedom. All of the structures I just mentioned are linear compositions. Every part is like a domino falling forward into the next part. We have Act 1, where audiences find out the circumstances of the story, the characters, the setting, the world we need to believe in. Then in the second act, something comes up that puts all of that in jeopardy. And finally, in Act 3, our characters, with their unique skill sets and quirks, handle the conflict and come to a resolution. Sometimes it's a happily ever after, sometimes not so much. Beyond these 3 key points, there's usually one other tidbit that we're taught, and it's one that never quite sat right with me. We're supposed to end the story where it began. And that truly doesn't make any sense on face value. Why would we spend so much time changing your characters, putting them through so much trauma, just to put them back at the beginning? There are 2 answers to this question. One of which is, I think, the one that's typically told if anyone does ask why we do this, and it's to emphasize the change. For instance, if you are doing a war story and your main character, a boy, leaves his home wide-eyed and eager to become an honorable man, and then he comes home at the end of the story world-weary and jaded, you will sense that a great change has happened because a different man is in the same setting. But when I stumbled upon ring composition, what I realized is that this idea of mirroring points within a story is a distillation of what ring composition used to be. And in ring composition, you do it to activate the memory. When we see something once, we're not likely to remember it, but when we see it twice, we dramatically increase our ability to retain that information. For example, when we're learning a new language, we have to see the same words over and over, usually in different contexts, before we can start using them instinctively on our own. This is why we love callbacks. A good callback can make us remember entire movies. For instance, if I say, on your left, most people will think of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If I say, as you wish, Princess Bride might spring to mind. Or if you're a Harry Potter fan, I must not tell lies will pluck some heartstring within you. This is a moment where I would ask the audience if they can think of any other callbacks. And if you are watching this, please leave a callback in the comments. One of the reasons I'm really excited to give lectures like this all over is because there's a great deal of movies I, as a single human being, just won't have had the opportunity to watch, so I'm excited to grow my to-watch list. So it's been scientifically proven that callbacks increase retention. You might have noticed that when you're watching a TV show that is being aired weekly and that has commercial breaks within it, that you are far more likely to retain details of that TV show than if you just binge it. This is because repetitive information that is spaced out activates our long-term memory. Another thing that activates our ability to create memories is strong emotions. So going back to that callbacks I just mentioned, when I say on your left, you might swell with the same emotion you had in Endgame when all of the superheroes come together to defeat Thanos. Or you might remember hating Professor Umbridge when you hear the phrase, I must not tell lies. The more memories we have of something, the bigger the neural link, the easier it is to recall something. So callbacks are inherent in getting the audience to remember your story. And here's something I should have said sooner. I cannot teach you how to make a good story. That is highly subjective. And if you're a screenwriter, for instance, there are a lot of factors that will be out of your hands. Who gets to direct it? Who is cast in it? If those actors are in any scandals right before your movie gets out, how much it is edited, how the studio chooses to market it. A lot of great scripts don't make it through the production pipeline unscathed. But what is not subjective is how well your story is remembered. There are even some terrible movies that we all still remember that had a cultural impact, and we wouldn't call them good movies. So we're going to put making a good story to the side because that is subjective. There is an art to it. But I can tell you how to make your story more memorable. The more callbacks that you're able to work in, subtle or overt, the more your audience will remember your story. I want you to think of the ring composition, which I'm about to explain, as muscles on top of bones. The bones is that 3-act structure we're all taught. The bones is the beginning, the middle, and the end. It is how the audience, after reading or seeing your story, will go and describe it briefly to your friend. It is how you might write your first outline. But when you want to get in depth, you put muscles on top of those bones, you flesh it out, and that is how we will talk about ring composition. So what is ring composition? The basic idea is that the second half is a mirror or reverse of the first half. When we are talking about the hero's journey or the 8-point arc or the 3-act structure, we normally talk in numbers. However, in the chiastic structure, ring composition, we talk in letters. So A, B, C, C, B, A, B, C, A, B, C. The reason that we do this is because, as I will get into a little bit later, the chiastic structure is stretchable. So you can go from A to Z and back again. We still have a beginning A, a middle, the C, and then end, the A again. Normally, the way that you would think about ring composition is instead of focusing on creating a beginning or an end, you would first focus on creating the middle and then working out from there. Unlike 3 acts, ring composition can move any way you want it to, but every part does have to have a counterpart. Stories that only begin and end at the same place aren't rings. The whole story has to work off of itself. Since we're not limited to a number of acts, the chiastic structure is stretchable. It can be a sentence or it can be a 6-book series. It's whatever you want it to be, but there does need to be a clear division between each part so that the audience has a way to clue in. This can be anything from a chapter break, a commercial break, a new episode in a TV show, or a new book in a book series. In a feature film, you can separate parts by time jumps or title cards or locations, just to name a few examples. And thirdly, the midpoint must be definitive. The audience should be able to tell immediately that the story is about to head back from whence it came. The middle point should hit home what the entire story is about. One way to think about this is that this is structural poetry. In poems, there is normally a rhyming element. These similar sounding words help activate the brain, and if done well, feel pleasant to the listener. That general effect is what we're aiming for when we employ ring composition. Let's get into some examples to help wrap your mind around what I'm talking about. There are a lot of famous quotes that have stood the test of time, in part because they are utilizing ring composition. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Fail to plan, plan to fail. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. This one is more of a subtle composition with the die and live, feet and knees. And that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But like I said, ring composition is stretchable, so while these are simple examples, I want to give you some complicated examples. These ones are vast, spreading over multiple entries. A lot of these examples come from ancient texts, like the Iliad or the Odyssey or Beowulf. It is theorized that in oral tradition, they utilized ring composition as a way to help the performer remember their place in the poem. These poems were not all performed in one sitting, so they would give what we would consider like a chapter of the story and then come back the next night or the next week and do the next chapter. It was easier for performers to know where they were going if they knew where they had already gone. But this idea that it was helping the performers remember also implies that it would help an audience remember. That's the beauty of using a structure that weaves itself together. And then the next example, the Bible. The entire Bible is not one big ring because the Bible was written over generations. Different stories have been taken out, some stories have been put in. But there are certain parts of the Bible, certain stories within the Bible that very clearly use this structure. And I want to talk about probably the most famous of all, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. For those of you who may not be familiar, this story is the serpent, aka the devil, goes to Eve and tempts her to eat the apple from the tree of life, the one thing God has told humans not to do. Adam eats it and then Eve eats it and then convinces Adam to eat it. And then they change, they get shame. God comes back to the garden and they hide from him because they know that they have done wrong. God eventually finds them and he questions Adam and then he questions Eve and then he questions the serpent. Once he realizes that Adam and Eve did eat the apple on purpose, he curses the serpent, then he curses Eve, then he curses Adam. And then he casts Adam and Eve out of the garden. I'm going to pause for a moment and talk about how overwhelming ring composition can come off. It's easy to get into this idea that every part and its counterpart has to be this big plot moment, but that is not true. It is not that deep. The one thing that you will notice about that Adam and Eve story is not every single plot point was a big dramatic moment. The rhyming couplets within ring composition can be anything from the same location, the same or reverse line of dialogue, the same or opposite order of things. The important thing to always remember when dealing with ring composition is don't overthink it. So let's look at that Adam and Eve story again. In the A's, there's a comment about how if you'll be like God, and now they are like God. In B, it's about clothing. In C, it's about them either hiding in or being cast out from the garden. So those are reverses, while A and B were similar. D through F and then F back through D is just the order of the way that God is talking to people. So now that we have a good idea of what ring composition is, and this is the part in the lecture where I would stop and ask the students if they have any remaining questions over what the structure is. If they don't, or after I've worked through those questions, I'm going to talk more about the reasons why I think every writer should know about ring composition. There are 4 reasons that I love the chiastic structure. The first 2, memorability and dissectability, are outward-facing reasons. The third and fourth reason, navigability and adaptability, are internal creative process. We've already talked quite a bit about memorability, so I'm just going to go straight to the second one, dissectability. I know that this is not a real word, but it falls within the theme, so I hope you'll forgive me. What I mean by dissectability is how your audience will be able to dissect your story. The more they can dissect it, the more they'll be talking about it. And we currently live in a world with so many critics. And critics need something to talk about. It's how they make their living. They physically need content to talk about. And unlike just 10 or 20 years ago, we have more critics than we've ever had. We still have traditional critics like the New York Times and print media, but we also have bloggers and TikTokers and YouTubers. Especially when we talk about YouTubers, they can be talking about your movie for hours. So they need a lot to dissect. In a 3-act structure, there's nothing to dissect about when the second act starts or when the third act starts. Those are just insider terms. However, ring composition, what you decide to put in the middle, how you decide to have parts and their counterparts, because of all of that contrast and comparison that you're doing within your own story, you're leaving room for interpretation. The more critics can interpret a story, the more they have to talk about. Also, if one critic makes a review of your story with their interpretation, and another critic has also seen your story but completely disagrees with that first critic's interpretation, now those critics are starting a conversation and a dialogue between themselves, which will create even more to talk about. This will create a positive spiral for you. The more people talk about your story, the more people will seek out your story. The more people who are seeing your story, the more people will be talking about it. So, memorability and dissectability are reasons to write this so that you gain an audience that can remember and can engage with your story. But let us move on to more internal reasons to write this way. Navigability. Every story does have to start with a hook, something that grabs the audience, otherwise they're just going to stop watching. And then every story has to have an end, preferably something satisfying so that the audience doesn't feel like their time has been wasted. But the 3-act structure doesn't give a lot of guidance on the middle, so much so that writers often complain about the dreaded middle. To avoid this no man's land, some writers will break the second act into 2 parts, Act 2A and Act 2B, all revolving around a simple midpoint, which is getting dangerously close to the same principles of ring composition, where the middle is the whole point. The middle is as vital as the beginning and the end. In fact, it is the whole point. If you know your middle, you can work out from there. It's hard to get lost when it's your starting point. The middle of a ring composition is where the message or the theme of your story can shine through. So just to toss out some examples, if you're writing a love story, the middle is where that love gets tested. If you're writing a horror story, the middle is where things truly get scary. If you're writing a mystery, the middle is where everything is a question and there are no answers to be found. In the Adam and Eve story, the central question is, what happens when you disobey God? This is the moral of that story. You're supposed to leave church after hearing it, going, I better not let anyone trick me into disobeying God because then I will get cast out. The middle of that story is God realizing that the apple was eaten on purpose. This has to happen for the rest of the story to proceed the way it does. If it had been an accident, God might have acted differently. If the apple had fallen from the tree and rolled down the hill and Eve found it somewhere else, maybe he would have wiped their memories and started again. But it's the fact that Eve let the snake convince her, that Adam let Eve convince him, that God realizes that they did it on purpose. And if you do something on purpose, you have to suffer the consequences. So whatever happens in the middle of your story should hit your main theme on the head. However, in ring composition, there are many ways to do a middle. So you can have this basic structure of ABC, CBA, where there is no unique midpoint. In the Adam and Eve story, it is an instantaneous moment that happens in God's mind of him realizing that he has to punish Adam and Eve. It is not a line of dialogue. There isn't a big drama about it. It is just him going, oh, this is the choice that I have to make. There are a lot of moments in stories and films where a character just has to make a choice that will change everything that comes after it. Or you can have a unique midpoint. And this is when the midpoint does not have a counterpart. It is the only point in your story that does not have a counterpoint. For instance, if you are writing a story about 2 people starting a family, the first half is building up to having that child. So they'll be reading all of the books, child-proofing the home, putting a savings together. The unique midpoint is the birth of that child. And then the rest of the story is realizing that none of the books were helpful, their child is too clever for the baby proofing, and that the savings goes way too fast. But the birth of the child has no counterpart, but it does change the entire story. And then the last option is a ring within a ring. So I actually just watched Glass Onion, Benoit Blanc mystery, and they build up to Andy being killed in the middle. And then it stops, and they have like a whole maybe 20-minute section of the movie where they are going back and they are showing how that's actually Helen because Andy was dead. Sorry if I'm spoiling Glass Onion, by the way. But that idea of you have the story moving in one direction and then you take the audience out of that main story, show them something that informs the rest of the story, and then you plug them back into the first main story. Ring composition can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be, which brings us to the final reason I love this structure: adaptability. You can do anything and everything with ring composition. And in this time, nobody really gets to do one thing anymore. A healthy career will cover all of these things. In Hollywood, where I've worked for the last 7 years, people write in film and TV, and more they're writing for vertical shorts. It is possible to just be a novelist, but if you're a prolific novelist, or if you're just a very, very good one, at some point, people will come and ask you to adapt your story, which more and more writers are wanting to adapt themselves. So I want to take a moment and talk about the current formats we're currently writing in. I just said current twice, I apologize. And then how we can transition those formats into rings. So currently, we have half-hour TV and an hour TV, which is a teaser followed by an odd number of acts. In feature, there are almost always 3 acts. Short forms don't really have acts, but they are usually 1 to 10 minutes long. However, for the ring theory, half hour and hour long can just be turned into even number of parts. I should talk a little bit more about feature and short form. So when I say that features can be unlimited and self-contained, one movie can be a ring. If you're doing a trilogy, each of those 3 movies can be a ring, or all 3 movies can be one big ring. But you should know in the beginning how many movies you want to make. For instance, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they have a ton of movies, but they also would know, phase 3 is going to be this many movies, and then phase 4 is going to be that many movies. So even that, like phases within a cinematic universe can be a ring. Short form, it is unlimited and expansive. So every episode could be a ring, every season could be a ring, the entire series can be a ring. You can even do something where you have like a main storyline and then you're putting little rings in where you can. You can have a side character who every once in a while they'll get their own episode and that's a ring. or their entire character arc is a ring while everybody else is on a more linear trajectory. You can do anything you want. Now that you understand the capabilities of ring composition, let's get into the practicalities of it. It is important to know that rings are just one tool in your toolkit. Like a painter has different types of paint to use on a canvas, oil, watercolor, acrylic, latex, etc., writers have different structures for different stories. You may not always want to use a ring composition, but I think it's to your detriment to not know about it at all, which is why I'm giving this lecture. However, like me, you may see this structure and everything clicks into place about how to tell stories. I read my first essay on ring composition in 2014, and I've basically been writing this way ever since, except when I get paid and somebody wants me to write another way, and then, they're paying me, I'm going to do what they want. So let's get into the specifics of how to do it. So we normally have two different camps when it comes to writers, pantsers and plotters. If this is new terminology for you, pantsers are people who just sit down and write without any sort of prep work. Plotters are people who will, write an entire outline, do a lot of prep work on the world that they're working on, and then they will sit down to actually write the manuscript. If you are a pantser, I suggest that you don't worry about ring theory when you are first putting down your story. But as you are going back over that first draft, if you're noticing anything repeating, like a color or an image or a phrase, stuff like that, use ring composition to put that repeating thing in with more purpose. Or if after you finish the first draft, you realize what this story is really about, go in and, make sure that the middle area really touches on it and work off of that. However, if you're a plotter, there are 3 things that I think that you should know before you start writing your manuscript. You need to know your purpose, your middle, and your scope. If you know how big the story has to be, the scope of it, then you will know where your middle is. If you know where your middle is, you will know where, what thematically you need to touch on. If we go back to one of the examples I said before, if you are writing a love story, that's such a vague thing. So maybe you're writing a platonic love story. Maybe you're writing a story about 2 friends. And in the middle, you need to test that friendship. So you'll need to know what tests it and in what way does it get tested so that the story is really saying what you want to say about friendships and about platonic love. So let us get into even more examples. At the beginning, I said to think of ring composition like muscles on bones. So I'm going to break down how to train your dragon in 3 different ways. Hopefully, people have seen How to Train Your Dragon. If not, it is about a boy named Hiccup, who is a young Viking, who his entire village kills dragons. But he doesn't want to kill dragons, and then he eventually befriends a dragon and realizes that you really don't need to be killing them. And then through a series of events, is able to convince the rest of his village that dragons do not want to be killed. Please pause to read this if you'd like. But this is Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. This might be how you explain your story if you're pitching it to a friend or to a producer or a publisher. If we want to go a layer deeper, This is the hero's journey. And you can go through and see all of the ways that we now have more detail in our plot of how things are happening. And then the next slide is going to be overwhelming, but just hold on for a second. This is the first half of How to Train Your Dragon in ring composition, and this is the second half. You can pause and go back to read those two, but I've taken out 3 of them just to show you the similarities. So it starts with Hiccup describing Burke and the dragons that attack it. The whole movie ends with Hiccup describing Burke and the dragons that live in it. Sort of in the middle of the first and second part is Astrid protects Hiccup from a looming dragon attack. Astrid and Toothless protect Hiccup from a dragon attack. And then in the middle, this is the middle part, Hiccup struggles to fly on Toothless, crashes into a rock, and falls off the dragon to save his cheat sheet. And then immediately after, Hiccup reconnects with Toothless, throws his cheat sheet away, and is able to fly on Toothless, navigating the danger. These are very specific plot points, but and the whole story is like this. And this is how detailed ring composition lets you be in a way that the 3-act structure or the hero's journey, it won't ever let you get this detailed in your outline. Sorry, I had to take some water. How to Train Your Dragon is a plot-based ring. So everything that is happening in the plot happens in a different way in the second half. However, there are some stories that are sort of ideas, right? To be fair, How to Train Your Dragon does have this idea, the first half being that dragons are evil, the second half being that dragons are good. But in Star Wars, Star Wars is actually also plot-based. There is an essay that I'm going to talk about later. But it is also ideals, right? The fall into dark, the return to light. Star Wars is the first story that helped me gain a full appreciation for ring composition. As like many people, I did not like episodes 1, 2, and 3 until I could see them in this bigger picture. And then I realized just how brilliant and ambitious George Lucas had been. There are many examples of rings within these 6 movies. I could honestly do an entire class on them. I'm sure someone has. But I just want you to understand that you can get as detailed as How to Train Your Dragon, or you can also keep it light and sort of this overarching idea within your story. Anything can be a chiasmus. Remember when I said don't overthink your counterparts? That's extremely important. I personally love writing my stories in strict accordance with ring composition, but you don't have to. You can find that it's just a way to use the underlying idea of repetition to your advantage. The idea of exact will probably only cause you pain if you cling to it too hard. A good metaphor might be, trying to hold a bird too tightly. Eventually you'll just sort of crush it. And I will say that there are a lot of people who won't write anything if it won't be perfect, quote unquote. I don't want the idea of chiastic to paralyze you. It really can be anything. It can be similar locations, similar props, or just the idea that you are playing with. but bringing back elements again and again in your story will activate your audience's long-term memory and give them something to interpret. I'm talking so much. 40 minutes, guys. So we're almost at the end, and I want to give you a reading list if this has piqued your curiosity. Aristotle, Poetics, the plays that he was talking about, the stories that he was talking about were those ancient poems that I brought up before, the Odyssey, the Iliad. And I know that Poetics is used to teach 3 acts. But if you go back and read it with ring composition in mind, I think that you will find that Aristotle is actually talking about ring composition more and more. So it's a great read with this in mind. Also, he talks about everything else, like characters, themes, pacing, not just the plot and structure, which is what this lecture has been about. For more contemporary analysis, Mary Douglas's Thinking in Circles breaks down ring composition in greater detail over many literary examples, much more than I can do in a single lecture. A little while ago, I mentioned that I read an essay that clued me into ring composition, and that was Mike Klimo's Star Wars ring theory. It is very long for an essay. I would honestly call it a dissertation, but it will give you a better appreciation of Star Wars as an epic. And then if you want something easier to read than these first 3 examples, there's a blogger called the Deja Reviewer who does a whole series on how some modern movies like How to Train Your Dragon or the Dark Knight trilogy, and that he honestly has like 30 examples up on his website of how they're broken down into rings. These 4 sources will be a very good, and I think if you study these 4 things, you should be able to write in ring composition fairly easily, which means you can let the fun begin. I wanted to end on this image as a reminder of how expansive ring composition can be. You can have just one ring. You can have rings within rings. You can have rings side by side. You can have a chain of rings, like a daisy loop. The important thing is to not overthink it. I've said this so many times, but as we've discussed, the more I say something, the more likely you are to remember it. Let your story flow. Have fun with it. At the end of the day, it is a privilege to be a storyteller. If you have watched this long, thank you. If you are curious about talking to me more, please leave a comment. I will be moderating this video and engaging in the comment section. If you would like me to come and talk to your students, please reach out. My goal is to teach as many people as I can about this amazing story structure. Thank you so much and have a good day.